Ever felt like you're just stuck? You know, like there's some invisible wall holding you back? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down a really powerful framework from Apostle Michael Orakbo that tackles that exact feeling, how to finally break free from those negative patterns and move forward for good.
So let's get right to the heart of it. Why is it that some families seem to deal with the same negative stuff generation after generation? Whether it's money problems, relationship issues, health struggles, it just keeps repeating. It's a huge question, right? And this teaching gives us a very specific spiritual angle on it. And this quote from the apostle really frames the whole conversation perfectly. He says, there are certain things that may be difficult to explain doctrinally, but never doubt their manifestation. See, what he's saying is we're not going to get bogged down in some dry academic debate. Nope. We're talking about real-life experiences, the stuff people actually face, even if we can't always neatly explain the why behind it.
All right, so here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to dig into what the apostle calls bloodline patterns. Got to understand the problem, right? Then we'll jump straight into the solution, which includes the 4 priesthood procedures and something he calls a spiritual weapon, service. After that, we'll take a look at the enemy's playbook, Satan's 6 operations, before wrapping it all up with your personal warfare strategy. Let's do this.
Okay, first up, understanding bloodline patterns. And this is so important because think about it. You can't fix a problem if you don't even know what it is. Getting a handle on this concept is really the key that unlocks everything else we're going to talk about.
So what are we actually talking about when we say bloodline pattern? Well, the teaching defines it as one of those recurring negative cycles. Constant setbacks, repeated failures, things that just seem to run in a family. And here's the kicker. The idea is that these cycles are only possible because of unresolved weaknesses in the family line. It's like those weaknesses give them an open invitation to operate. And this isn't just some abstract idea. The speaker points to really specific things. We're talking about stuff like spirit molestation, especially in dreams, or that incredibly frustrating pattern where things always seem to fall apart right when you're on the verge of a breakthrough. It can even show up as generational diseases like diabetes or madness, or even cycles of people dying young at a particular age. And it can also be patterns of sin like lying or alcoholism that just seem to have a grip on an entire family.
And to really drive this point home, he uses this fascinating example from the Bible. Check this out. He looks at Abraham and his son Isaac and points out these spooky similarities in their lives. I mean, they had the same taste in women, they told the exact same lie to the same king, they even had the same impulse to run off to Egypt when a famine hit. The point he's making is that you can often trace these weaknesses right down the family tree. All right, so if these patterns are the problem, how in the world do you break free from them? Well, this is where it gets really practical. The teaching lays out a clear solution, starting with what he calls the 4 priesthood procedures. This is a real step-by-step guide to getting your freedom back. And to really understand why these procedures are so important, the apostle shares this powerful personal story. He talks about a vision he had where he saw 2 demonic beings, and he was told that these beings had been controlling the destinies in his family line. But get this, it wasn't because they had some kind of legal right. No, it was because they had an advantage that was given to them by what he calls forces of flesh in his bloodline. And this gets to the core of the idea. In his personal story, he was shown 4 specific weaknesses that were giving these beings power in his family: lying, pride, drunkenness, and womanizing. He describes these behaviors as gates, like open doors that give these negative forces all the access they need to come in and mess things up.
So, that brings us right to the 4 steps you need to take, the 4 priesthood procedures. Step 1, discern the pattern. You gotta study the cycle, know what you're up against and when it tends to show up. Step 2, shut the gates. This is huge. You have to consecrate yourself to God and consciously stop doing the things that give the enemy access. Step 3, enforce the finished works of Christ. This means you declare your victory, not because you're so strong, but because of what Christ has already done. And finally, step 4, demand mercy. You rely completely on God's sovereignty and grace to cover anything you might have missed. Okay, so on top of those direct procedures, the teaching offers another incredibly powerful strategy. And this isn't just a one-time fix. It's more of an ongoing lifestyle that becomes your ultimate defense strategy. And that is committed service.
The way the apostle puts it is pretty intense. He says one of the ways you break those things is through committed service. You become like a burnt offering. That's what stops it. That image of a burnt offering, it really speaks to a life that's just completely and totally dedicated to God. And in this framework, that kind of dedication is what builds a wall that these negative cycles just can't get through.
And he doesn't just leave it as a theory. He shares his own story to prove it. He talks about how, even with a master's degree, he was stuck earning just $20,000. He was going nowhere. But he testifies that the major turning point in his life, the moment when, as he says, things broke out from every side, was when he became totally sold out in service to God. That's when everything changed. Now, to make all these strategies work, you really have to understand what you're up against. You got to know your enemy's tactics. So this next part dives into what the teaching describes as Satan's 6 main operations, the key ways he tries to keep people in bondage.
So here are the 6 primary operations we're looking at. First, there's darkened understanding, which is all about creating confusion and blindness. Then there's lawlessness, that pull towards chaos and doing evil. Third, fear and torment, which are designed to paralyze you and stop you in your tracks. And then you have the 3 big, tangible weapons: sickness and affliction, poverty, and finally, death.
Let's zoom in on poverty for a second, just as an example. The speaker gives a really balanced view on this. On one side, he's clear that universal principles absolutely matter. Things like hard work, investing, being productive, using your gifts, that stuff is essential. But he adds a spiritual dimension. He says that Satan can specifically attack your finances to cripple your ability to do what God has called you to do. Another major tactic he talks about is fear, and this is a big one. The idea is that fear is such an effective weapon because it just paralyzes people. It makes you freeze up and miss your God-given opportunities, your seasons of destiny. So what's the countermove? The teaching says you have to stay stirred up in the spirit. You have to be intentional about it because that's what activates power, love, and a sound mind. All right, we've covered a lot of ground. We've looked at the problem, we've looked at the solution, and we've even looked at the enemy's playbook. So now let's put it all together. This last part is all about boiling it down into a clear, personal warfare strategy that you can actually use. So your strategy really comes down to these 4 core actions. First, cast out devils. This means using the authority you have in the name of Jesus in every part of your life, not just on a Sunday morning. Second, wrestle principalities. You've got to be an active participant in your own spiritual fight. Don't be a passive victim. Third, avoid sin. He describes a sinful lifestyle as something that can literally silence your faith and make it powerless. And finally, number 4, avoid unbiblical practices. Basically, trust the instructions in the Bible, not man-made rituals or traditions. And so after all of that, it all comes down to this. This is where the rubber meets the road. The teaching leaves us with one very simple but deeply personal question. What gate do you need to shut today?